Welcome to Josie to Lagos, an African podcast from Africa for Africa. Why not? We need this kind of content. For too long, the African story has been told to Africans from the Western gaze, from the narrative of CNN and BBC and all of these other international entities, and they often miss the nuance, the detail, the relevant factors to consider because, after all, they're looking at Africa from the outside. The Josie to Lagos show seeks to change that. The purpose of this podcast is to reflect on the African moment. It is to pursue an understanding of the continent and its institutions and hopefully answer this very important question. Why is Africa not performing to her full potential? And how can we, as young and passionate Africans, change the trajectory of the continent? Today, we're having a very interesting conversation with a young Pan-African leader, Mmusi Maimane. He has been very involved in several pan-continental discussions concerning Sudan, concerning Zambia, concerning Zimbabwe. So I managed to get a hold of him and I put a few questions to him, and we're all going to unpack his vision for Africa and some of those critical moments that he had in the continent and his reflections on those moments. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Maimane.
It is indeed my great privilege to be on with you, Jane.
You are a leader of a coalition of opposition movements across the continent. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? When did it happen and what do you guys do?
A number of years ago, we recognized the fact that Africa needed to head towards its own post-liberation democratic dispensation. And so a number of leaders who in many ways faced the same challenges of being in opposition to liberation movements, whether they were in Zimbabwe, whether they were in Zambia, whether they in the southern part of Africa, Angola, Tanzania, got together and said, what is the vision that we hold for a post-liberation Africa or post-liberation movement Africa? And so we established an association. That association needed to focus on a number of objectives. The first one was, how do we advance democracy? How do we build a prosperous economy for the region? How do we hold leadership accountable? And how do we ensure that all the infrastructure that underpins a democratic state, whether it be about the role of the media, the judiciary, what type of state you want to build, and that infrastructure is upheld. And so as an outcome of that particular conversation, we established that. We had a secretariat, and it's still functioning well, and it's acted as a very effective tool to support opposition leaders. And now, fortunately, many leaders who have transitioned into government.
Can you tell me what your experience has been working as a person within the ranks of opposition across the continent in respect to opposition politics themselves? Can you maybe compare it to South Africa? And do you have like a wild example which just showed you the discrepancies, if there are any?
I think the point is summed up well when I remember meeting the then president of Tanzania. And he made a statement at a leadership forum I happened to be a part of, which his words were, "It is about time that we treat the opposition better, because who knows, they could be the government." Which told me that, in fact, outside of South Africa, liberation parties had held themselves in the esteem of saying, in some ways, they're not democratic, almost as though they govern with a sense of this belief that it's their God-given right, and naturally meant that they would govern forever. Secondly, that in fact opposition wasn't just an opposition of ideas and ideals, but really an opposition of this divine rule. And therefore they felt as dictators, and anyone who opposed that was regressing the advances of the struggle, as it were, was working against the interests of the people in general, and therefore needed to be treated, rather than the opposition, truly as the enemy. And so that advances itself to other practices where we've seen brutality, we've seen undemocratic processes where there's the banning of opposition parties, the undermining of constitutional democracy, where in other parts of Africa, leaders are extending their terms of office, all in the name of democracy, where elections are simply ceremonial, but actually decisions are prejudged. And more than anything, the capture of the state results itself in the capture of the judiciary, which means that for those member states, the decisions about elections are already pre-concluded. South Africa, as one of the countries, at least in the Southern African part, experienced its own liberation much later on in the game, has started off well in the first perhaps number of years in terms of democratic practice and constitutionalism. And all of those have remained intact, at least certainly for the first 26 years of South Africa's democracy. It isn't a guarantee when I reflect on the question even more, because as you have seen, South Africa's partnership, even with ZANU-PF in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, is that there's an inherent belief that the same liberation politics are starting to play themselves into play. So whilst the contestation here in South Africa has been fairly, liberation movements winning outright as the ANC, as they've become threatened to lose power, I've seen certain practices then begin to not only mirror those of other countries. So recently, post this COVID time, despite all of that, South Africa has experienced quite a use of military force, with citizens in certain communities being killed by an army. Now, it's not widespread abuse, but it is the impulse that begins to mirror that of other liberation movements. We've seen the factionalization of the media rather than the independence of the media, and conference resolutions even by the ANC to say you need a media ombudsman so that you can decide who and how the media adjudicates its own internal affairs. We're seeing more and more as even the matters of the judiciary, when you think about the case of Judge Hlophe in the Western Cape, not that in the sense of which there is almost the judicial independence that South Africa has become very accustomed to, sometimes becoming something that you can see becoming a little bit more politicized in our nation. So I think, to me, the hints are there, yet South Africa is still a long way from there. We still have a much bigger private sector, which is a safeguard in other instances. So you've still got private media. You've allowed yourself to have social media that allows the transparency to be far easier. Spectrum, in some instances, still remains in certain private companies, which means citizens are free to engage in other content. So there's still, in many ways, a counterbalance to just the pervasive nature of the state. But I cannot sit here today and say that is a guarantee that will remain in eternity for South Africa as more as elections become closer and closer.
That's an interesting answer. And obviously people would be concerned because South Africa is one of the great examples. I want to ask you, though, a story this time. Can you tell us what happened in Zambia? A lot of people may not know, but can you just give us the story and tell us what was going on?
Oh, the leader of opposition there, Hakainde Hichilema, HH, gets, in my view, illegally arrested for literally interrupting the motorcade of President Edgar Lungu. And whilst that happens, I feel an injustice about this issue, and he then is put in solitary confinement for that particular crime. He's then told that, no, he must now go off and appear in court. We board a flight at OR Tambo to attend this court hearing. And literally, without any sense, we go through the process. Well, I cross the South African border, we immigrate. I meet a number of Zambian brothers and sisters on the plane. We start having conversations. Many of them have businesses in both South Africa and Zimbabwe and Zambia. So the relationships are established on the plane. Whilst on this flight, I'd never been to Zambia before, at least not flown in there, travel via land. I noticed that in our landing, the plane not only has slowed down, but we eventually land in the furthest distance of the runway. I think to myself, no, this is bizarre. The last time I experienced this was on the arrival of Assange in France when I landed in Paris, and I thought, what is the security? What is the military? And my immediate thought is someone on this plane has taken drugs. Honestly, I think to myself, it's about to go down here.
Yeah.
So I'm looking around thinking these passengers I've met on the bus, hey, I hope one of them doesn't get treated badly or something.
Exactly.
And I think This is going to be entertaining. So I pull out my phone. I noticed the military on the tarmac. I start taking pictures of the military and thinking to myself, wow, this is going to be interesting as we taxi our way through. Eventually, the plane comes to a stop after what felt like a 15-minute taxi ride on this plane. And unbeknownst to me, the military enter the plane first, which I thought this is quite bizarre. They normally let people off, but I'll just carry on filming. And the head of the thing looks at me, of the army, points at me and says, "You, sir, you are not going anywhere."
Oh.
I say, what on earth has happened here? So I think to myself, okay, I put my phone down because now I realize I might be the one with drugs on my luggage or something weird like that. They come up to me, a number of people, and we were traveling with one security and my chief of staff back then. They eventually look at the images that they'd been sent, and then they point out the two of them and tell them, we are all sitting down, no one is disembarking this plane. It becomes a tense situation as I become handled, and someone says to me, "Sorry, you are not allowed to enter Zambia." I said, this is completely unacceptable. You, on what basis and on what rights? They eventually said, I remember the saying from the military commander saying, "Sir, the temperature is rising." And at that point, I didn't think I was in trouble. I thought to myself, this was just a scuffle we'd get into and no one would happen, until the pilot came to me and said, "Sorry, Mr. Maimane, you are now not only delaying the next flight going out, but sir, I don't know if you realize," he speaks to me in Afrikaans, he says, "you are in real trouble." And I still, back then, they asked for all my equipment, iPad, cell phone. They confiscate all of the phone I had. They confiscate the laptop. And then he says, can he ask for the equipment so that when I land in South Africa, he can give it back to me eventually. Even up until that point, I tried to phone the South African ambassador who was there to meet us. I couldn't get through eventually. I tried to phone the Zambian ambassador, the leader of the opposition. Now, with the final nail that made me realize how deep in trouble I was, the same man I'd met on a bus in Zambia, in Johannesburg, walked past and said to Mr. Maimane, "I also run private prisons here in Zambia. Here's my business card. If they take you to one, ask them to bring me to mine." Then I realized, actually, this thing was down. So here I was, lying face down in the middle of the plane. They literally detained all of us. I requested to say, in the silver lining to the story, I said, "Can I go use the bathroom?" They said, "Fine, you can." I then grabbed my bag. They said, "No, you can't take that." But what they didn't know is that I had a spare phone. So I got onto the back of the plane, called South Africa, called my friends there to say, warn the ambassador, warn the South African media that I've literally been detained on the tarmac in Zambia, and they won't let me go, they won't let the plane go, and they are preparing for me to go to a prison. And as the matter then rose, I've never put my phone in the most uncomfortable place in my life, because I knew walking out of that bathroom, if they found the phone, then I would have effectively then committed the next crime, which would allow them to effectively charge me then. And we were literally stuck there. They refused to let us go. They took us out. And that's how people are treated. And I'll never forget the day, because it made me realize that your rights mean nothing on the tarmac of Zambia. And before we knew it, they kept us there. An hour later, they came back and said, new passengers are coming in. They gave us new tickets and said, "You are heading back home, sir." And that would be, in a way, to realize that you have no rights when you're on the tarmac.
Yeah, that's a very sobering story. I mean, it has funny moments, but it makes one wonder about the state of democracy and rights in Zambia. What were your reflections when you were flying back now after being manhandled, after being intimidated, for wanting to go and watch a court process?
Well, not only was I angry, first of all, I was angry because now you have the person I'd come to support stuck in the middle of a prison. I'm angry because my rights have been violated. I could not enter Zambia, and still today they've declared me undesirable. I immediately said I'm going to go and request that the Zambian government must inform us as to what in fact has gone wrong here. And more than anything, you realize when you think about the state of democracy, that the use of military and the militarization of any democracy, that this concept of the commander-in-chief of the army being the president, the political appointee, that also has its flaws, and that same person can then command the army to do things, because the army is not designed in such a way to perform police affairs. It is designed to do military affairs. And therefore, when the army flooded that plane, we knew that they don't deal with rights, they don't deal with any other questions. Those things become suppressed. And it's true, because it makes you realize that if you oppose the state in any form, because when I asked the Zambian ambassador here in South Africa, I said, why did you detain me? They said to me, actually, we read your statements that you'd issued, that your sole intention was to destabilize the state of Zambia. And if I, sitting in South Africa, by making statements of support of the opposition in Zambia, can destabilize the government, imagine what happens when you are in opposition day to day. So I think the state of democracy in countries like that is one where voting is ceremonial. As for the rest, the institutions of democracy are undermined.
Yeah, that's actually quite sobering, because I don't think anything in your statements would have been tantamount to calling for a revolution or anything to that effect. I want to ask you about next door to Zambia. You worked at some period with Morgan Tsvangirai, the former leader of the Movement for Democratic Change. What were your experiences with the late Morgan Tsvangirai?
The late Morgan Tsvangirai, for me, was an incredible citizen, an incredible Zimbabwean. Morgan Tsvangirai, I remember always, in fact, conceptually in framing the ideals of what post-liberation Zimbabwe would look like, was one of the things that he framed deeply. He had a deep conviction for Zimbabwe, and certainly was ruthless when he wanted to be. I mean, I sat in meetings when he wanted to get his point across, and you knew that you couldn't just literally oppose him because of the force of character that he was. He was always committed to finding another way, and I admired him for that. I found him intellectually stimulating and very smart as a person. And when we were working together, certainly, he had a commitment to say, how do we raise resources for Southern Africa? He had a commitment to say, he tempered me down in terms of, you can't just treat liberation movements just in a dismissive term, that you needed to hold them at bay, but realize that those same liberation movements had played a role, but you needed to articulate a chapter post them. So he tempered down my sort of anti-liberation movements in that sense. But he's certainly he's certainly someone who's helped me frame my thinking in much of what goes on in Africa and what role we could play. I would argue that for me, for as far as statesmen that I've had an opportunity to encounter in the recent while, probably would be someone like him, and probably someone like Olusegun Obasanjo, who is still a close personal friend and someone who I admire, has helped me get an understanding of what happens in Southern Africa and ultimately what happens in East Africa and in relation to both.
Well, it sounds like he had a massive impact on you as a leader and also maybe on your leadership. But I want to ask you, what were your thoughts as the coup was unfolding in Zimbabwe in late 2017, the fall of Mugabe? Having spent time with Morgan Tsvangirai, what did you think about that particular moment?
Yeah, I mean, one, as I was dealing with the opposition there were a couple of issues. One, well, let me place it in context. So a year or two before that, I get invited to sit with the Movement for Democratic Change with a conversation about how they could solidify opposition in Zimbabwe. One of the questions that were set in that conversation was twofold. The first was, what was the policy approach to the issue? And the second was not only a discussion about positions, but what would be the relationship with the army? Because it was very clear that the army generals had become very committed to taking over what was going on there and were dictates as to who could lead and who couldn't. It almost in many ways said it's irrelevant whether Mugabe wants to stay or go, the army will decide who stays and who goes. So when the coup took place, and it should be called that, I realized back then that the army and the army generals had finally amassed the power that they were discussing. And it was irrelevant at that point. They'd chosen their own succession plan. They knew that in working with Emerson, they'd found an ally who they could control. The second issue was that the army generals had usurped the Zimbabwean constitution, in that now, ultimately, now you had created a situation upon which the constitution of Zimbabwe makes it only possible to have one commander-in-chief. And now you had another commander-in-chief dictating to the people, to the army, as to what the army can do. So even though Mugabe had a say or no say, he had no say, and his power had been taken down. And I knew at that point that you were creating a revolving door of unconstitutionality that would follow, and nothing would ever be established in Zimbabwe. And when I remember what Morgan Tsvangirai had also shared with us, was that ultimately that whole ZANU-PF formation was never interested in truly building a prosperous Zimbabwe. They were self-serving liberators who had turned into dictators. And the net consequence of it is that even if it found it favorable in and of itself to bring on Emerson, it would still be a continuation of more of the same, just with the army in charge. And it became even more prevalent when we sent an observer mission as part of my former party to go observe the elections in Zimbabwe, that in fact, actually, the elections would also become ceremonial. Emerson had been in power, and the net consequence of it is that even if he remains as the figurehead, the army still has much to say about what takes place in Zimbabwe.
And what are your thoughts about the recent events this year? The arrest of Hopewell Chinono, Jacob Ngarivume, the intimidation, and the Zimbabwean Lives Matter movement. You were relatively involved in that. What are your thoughts on the Zimbabwean moment now? And do you think that what the ANC did was sufficient?
I think it speaks to the broader theme we've been discussing. Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans, democracy there has failed, and democracy has failed the people of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, in a sense, as we sit here today, is a failed state. Furthermore, that the democratic practices are gone. There's a continuation of ZANU who have turned into dictators and are treating Zimbabweans' lives as though those lives do not matter. So it is common cause that there's going to be an acceleration of a practice that already been going on for a long time. The arrest of Hopewell is not a new event. The arrest of Tsitsi is not a new thing. We've hosted members of parliament who were exiled from Zimbabwe under Mugabe, and the same, when Emerson came on board, the same people were exiled to come back to South Africa, that they couldn't, as a member of parliament, enjoy the basic security of operating in a democratic space. So when I look at Zimbabwean television, I knew very clearly that the channel there was only going to produce state-sponsored propaganda. That even on other matters and the use of the army to do the work of basic civilian control, which is ultimately dangerous for any citizen, were going to be practices that are going to continue. So from my perspective and where I sit, I think what Zimbabwe is dealing with now at the moment is a dictatorship. It's a liberation movement that's for long forgotten its role and hasn't got the interests of the people at heart. The practices that are there are going to continue. And what the ANC's big dilemma is that now it has to stand up and face up to its own fellow liberation movement. And as a net effect of that, the ANC is incapable of that. Because not only does it celebrate Robert Mugabe as a liberator, it has failed to identify Robert Mugabe's practices in his latter half of his presidency as ones that oppress the rights of citizens. And it fails to recognize that what Emerson Mnangagwa is doing there is actually quite oppressive. And South Africans would never have tolerated that had it come from an apartheid regime. Why is the ANC in its role there failing to recognize similar practices when they've been enacted by Emerson Mnangagwa against the citizens of Zimbabwe? So I always maintain, I stand with the people of Zimbabwe. We stand on the Zimbabwe Lives Matter. Given level 1 status of South Africa and that restrictions have been dropped, would welcome an opportunity to go to Zimbabwe, because I think ultimately change must occur there. And my proposal still remains, how do we ensure that we build an interim transition government there? That would have been what I would be looking for. I would have looked for the ANC to set up a form of interim transition government that incorporated both the government and the opposition, and then head towards a democratic election upon which Zimbabwean citizens can make and express their change. And also that the diaspora of Zimbabwe is able to play a contributing role, not only to the rebuilding of Zimbabwe, but given the right to vote about what goes on in Zimbabwe, given the state of where the nation is at. So I certainly think that South Africa has a crucial role to play in the re-stabilizing of Zimbabwe. And if we continue the path that we're in, it's worse than quiet diplomacy, because now it's factional diplomacy, which will ultimately mean that the broader interest of the people of Zimbabwe and the democratic practice there is being lost.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think it's quite comprehensive. I want to move a little bit, because we're running out of time, and ask you, what does Pan-Africanism mean and represent for you?
Africa suffers from a deep history of not only colonization, but in many ways the extraction of its own raw materials, skills, people, at first expressed in some ways through slave trade, later expressed as a function of the extraction of raw materials for the benefit of countries, European, Chinese. And now, today, we are living in an Africa upon which its own capability of not only its autonomy, but the use of its own resources to building a prosperous continent feels and looks in certain instances as though that destiny has been robbed of the people of Africa. So my stance on this issue is that we have to review the view that the economist had of Africa as a dark continent, to build a new continent, an Africa upon which we can accelerate intra-trade, where we can ensure that actually Africans are able to retain resources, beneficiate them, and be able to maintain stability within the continent through economic prosperity. That ultimately, that Africa's, as a people, can collaborate together, work within the continent. And clearly, Africa is not an island on its own, for no man is. But if we're going to see a prosperous Africa, not only do we have to think as Africans, find solutions that are appropriate for our continent, but truly occupy a rightful place in the geopolitics of the world as equal citizens, not as servants of some European or neo-colonialist approach, or ultimately the extraction of resources out of the continent. So, and it manifests itself in the international bodies that sit, whether it's Africa's seat in the UN Security Council, whether it's Africa's seat in the Global Developmental Agenda that speaks to how we deal with climate issues, whether it's Africa's seat in the pharmacological sector, where we create our own healthcare opportunities so that Africa can respond to that question, whether it's in the security discussion, where Africa's own democratic practices are able to be operated within Africa, and that we can keep stability here in the continent. These are conversations that Africa must reflect on, and build a cadre of leadership that is able to respond to these challenges.
So in conclusion, my last question to you would be, what is your hope and vision for the future of Africa?
Look, I think certainly what we need is, my hope for Africa is that in a continent that will face a massive population bulge, that we begin to build a few things. The first, most crucial, is that we need a younger leadership. This is not being ageist, but by younger, it needs the agility to transition into what is the fourth industrial revolution. And countries are starting to demonstrate that, as Kenya has become now a finance hub and maybe perhaps innovating around technology. but that Africa needs to be able to own that space for the future of its continent. We have a population bulge coming. South Africa in the next, between 2040, will have probably, just over 1 billion citizens. And therefore, I think we need to think harder about what that will mean for Africa's own development. That's on the first instance. The second instance is, I think Africa, when I was saying that it needs to reclaim its seat on the global table, I think for many European countries who benefited through colonialism or benefited through slavery, and certainly the US and China alongside with that, need to be able to make compensation for that. I think there's a question of justice. Otherwise, we won't be able to have a fair and equitable conversation about the environment or matters such as sustainable development for a global community. Thirdly, I think Africa must build a better negotiating team so that we're able to get the best deals for Africa. Because at this point in time, we run the risk of certain nations, thanks to their vulnerabilities, being recolonized by other nefarious interests. And we can see that when loans are being issued from other countries, that ports are being taken over, etc., etc. Intertrade in Africa will require much better infrastructure build so that when Africans are doing trade amongst each other, we talk about world-class, not only digital infrastructure, but road infrastructure. It cannot take longer for a container to leave Kinshasa and end up in Mombasa, in comparison to that same container leaving Mombasa to China. It's quicker to get there than it is to get intra-Africa. And I think that you simply can't have that type of situation occurring. So better infrastructure. And then lastly, I think my hope is that this continent would lead in the next decade. This is Africa's decade to take. This is Africa's decade, as I was saying, in the pharmacy, in the healthcare sector, as I was saying, even in matters such as its own environmental sustainability, its own educational outcomes, and that the diaspora can contribute significantly to Africa. I think this is the change that we need to see. So I'm hopeful for this Africa, and I believe that if we build a new leadership that is able to not only compete within Africa, but compete globally, we can bring about the change. Aluta Kontumua.
And there it is, Mmusi Maimane's thoughts on Africa, on certain African experiences that he's had, and his vision for a future Africa. I wonder what you think about his contributions. I wonder what you think about his experiences. If you feel like you want to share and comment, you are more than welcome to do so, either on the podcast platform itself or on social media. Thank you so much for tuning in, and may you stay safe, stay healthy till the next episode.